Hi, this is David here, and in this video I want to give you an overview of the speaking test for IELTS so that you understand exactly what's going to happen when you do your interview. So in the IELTS interview, you will meet an officially trained IELTS examiner, and it will be a face-to-face discussion where the examiner will ask you questions, and of course you need to talk in English as best you can. So let's just look at the construction of the test here. So there are three parts actually, and this is part one. The interaction is question and answer format. So of course your examiner will ask you questions and you simply answer those questions. And as you can see, you'll get three different topics, and of each topic you'll get a number of questions. So for topic one there are 3 questions. For topic 2, there are 4 questions, and for topic 3, there are another 4 questions. And that means that you can expect to get about 11 questions that you need to talk about. It might be less than 11 because it does depend on how the time is going. And you can see that part 1 will take about 4 to 5 minutes in length. Then we move to part 2. So part 2 is called an individual long term, and this is quite different to the normal question and answer type thing that perhaps you are more familiar with. Here you have to speak for 2 minutes without interruption, so the examiner will take a more passive role and the examiner will simply listen to what you are saying. He or she will not stop you, will not ask you follow-up questions, and will not give you any comments or feedback as you are talking. You simply have to talk to the examiner for 2 minutes without any interruption. Now, you do get 1 minute to prepare your ideas, and you're given some paper and a pencil to make notes. The topic itself will be given to you by the examiner. You cannot choose. Now, part 2 takes about 3 to 4 minutes, and the timing is fairly accurate. So don't worry, it's never going to be more than 2 minutes. Now let's look at what happens in part 3. So part 3 is back to the question and answer session. Now here the topic you get is related in some way to part 2, and we'll look at some examples of for part 1, part 2 and part 3 of the kind of questions and topics you have. But just to give you an example, part 2 you might have to talk about a school that you went to, and then in part 3 you might have to talk about some kind of topic such as education, which is of course related to schools. Now the kind of questions in part 3 are a little bit more challenging. The examiner is trying to see how well you can explain and what kind of detail you can go into. And then part 3 will take about 4 to 5 minutes. So let's look at some example questions in a bit more detail, and of course we'll begin with part 1. So part 1 is all about familiar topics, and actually the first topic that you get is not much of a secret. So here it is. You're either going to be asked about where you live or what you do. It's one or the other, where you live or what you do. So let's just see some example questions, starting with where you live. You've got things like, what is the area like where you live? What kind of house do you live in? Do you like the place where you live? And then if we look at what you do, which really relates to two kinds of things. Either you work or you are a student. So the first question would be, do you work or are you a student? And then, of course, you've got questions about your job. If you work, what do you like about your job? Will you change your job in the future? Or if you're a student, then some sample questions might be, what subjects are you studying? What do you enjoy about your studies? And will you study more about this in the future? So you can see that from these example questions, they are quite familiar and not too scary. Now, as I told you, there are two more topics. So just give you a few examples of topics 2 and 3 in part 1, and these are just examples. They are not ones from the real IELTS test, but they do give you a clearer idea of the kind of questions you need to talk about. So holidays is the first example. What do you do when you have a holiday? What did you do for a holiday when you were a child? Do people in your country get enough holiday time? Is your country a good place for a holiday? And the next one, we have eating habits. So, do you like to eat at home or at restaurants? Do you like to try food from different countries? Do you like to watch television programs about food? And the fourth one, do you think it is important to eat healthy? And one more example now. This one is about sleep. How many hours should a person sleep? Did you sleep more or less when you were a child? What do you do if you cannot sleep? Is it important to get enough sleep? So I think you can see from these example questions that they're not too complicated, there's nothing tricky about the questions, and they cover fairly familiar topics. Now, I'm just introducing what happens in the test, so in other videos I will go into more detail about the strategies and how to answer these. I don't want to talk about them here though. I will say, of course, that in addition to the questions here, you might get asked why or why not. So for example, is your country a good place for a holiday? Yes, it is. Why is it a good place? Okay, so that's part 1 for familiar topics and familiar questions. Let's look at part 2. So if you remember, part 2 is different because you have to talk for 2 minutes without interruption. Now, part 2 is really about experiences. So we're going from familiar topics to your experiences. And here are a few examples of the kind of instructions you will get. So you talk about a book you have read, talk about a movie you have seen, a restaurant that you enjoy visiting, a person you spend a lot of time with, and a time when you were happy. So these are the kind of things, and basically you have to talk about a topic like that for 2 minutes. Once again, I won't go into the strategies here, I'm just showing you what you can expect in the IELTS test. So let's move on finally and talk about part 3. Now, part 1 of course was familiar topics. Part 2 was talking about some of your experiences, and part 3 is about more general issues related to the topic given in part 2. So let's look at some examples. So if you were talking about a book, then you might be discussing reading habits. If you're talking about movies, then part 3 would probably talk about entertainment, the effect of entertainment, the advantages and disadvantages of being a celebrity, things like that. If you're talked about a time when you were happy in part 2, part 3 would move on to questions about the concept of happiness, what makes people happy and why, that kind of thing, and also achievement as well. So there are some angles that come in. So in part 3, you can expect something about comparisons, talking about similarities and differences between things. Of course, giving your opinion, whether you agree or disagree with a certain idea, and of course explaining and justifying your opinion. And number 3 is speculation. So speculation, I am talking about the future, what you expect to happen in the future. So if we talk about reading habits, you might talk about reading habits in the future. If you talk about happiness, you might talk about if people will become more happy or less happy in the future. So just give as much details as you can. So there you have it. That is an explanation of what happens in the speaking test for the IELTS and the kind of questions and things that you need to do in the test. Now, if you want to know more, of course, go on to the next videos where I go through the skills and strategies that you need in order to perform well in each of the parts of this test. So we have a video for part 1, part 2, and part 3. But that is the end of this overview of the speaking test. Thank you.